following program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.
Good afternoon, and welcome again. This is another of the Veterans Forum programs here coming to you from the Community Access Station in Nashua, New Hampshire. Today is the 23rd of October, 2014. We're fighting the clock on the calendar. This program is being produced in conjunction with the Library of Congress's Veterans History Project, wherein they have been asking stations such as this, and guys like me, I guess, if they can and will offer to any and all veterans, male and female, the waves, the whacks, the nurses, if you will, if they can and will share their service experiences on a televised interview. That data will be fed to the Library of Congress for inclusion in their database, but the guy and gal will get a copy of the program for themselves. And if you look at it, it's perhaps one of the best legacies or Christmas presents you can give your family. It's priceless, it won't cost you a dime. Just telling the people what you did during the war, wherever and whenever you did it. Now, before we start, though, I'd like to share this with you. It's something I got a couple of weeks ago. It's a statewide telephone system, if you will. The number 211, not 911, but 211, will give any veteran or a friend or family member who thinks that guy or gal may need some help. They'll connect you with, you probably can't read this, but this is a list of different people who will be there to help you. It's yours to get, ask for it, you deserved it, okay? Now, today we have another great show. Every one of them is different, but they all have the same idea, sharing what they did. A lot of times we can't get the memory machine to work too well, but most of these guys are pretty sharp. I'll ask Russ to introduce himself, and then we'll get the show on the road. Young fella, you're on. If you will, please tell us who you are, spell out your last name, where you now live, your branch of service, and dates of service.
Oh, I don't know if I can remember all that.
Okay.
I am Russell Ober, officially Russell T. Ober III, so there are two before me, my father and grandfather. I live in Hudson, New Hampshire. I was in the Air Force for 22 years, and I retired in 82 or 83. That cover it?
Yeah, that wraps it up pretty quick. A lot of time in that word. Now, I want to start the show. I'd like to show, if you will, this photograph of Russ way back when. Things have happened, and we're going to find out what they were. Okay? Now, where and when were you born, and how was life growing up as a kid back in those days?
Well, I sometimes don't like to admit it, but I was born in Worcester, Mass.
Oh.
As were both my father and my grandfather. And I grew up in several places. Sometimes in Worcester, we moved to Shrewsbury. My parents moved to Long Island while I lived with the grandparents. And then my sister and I moved to Long Island. And then I moved to Syracuse, and we spent most of the time there. I was born in 1938, which made me before World War II, but not eligible for it.
Well, you're lucky. Now, how was life growing up? Any of your family members, for example, in the service at that time or now?
Well, in World War II, my uncle, my father's brother, was in the Army Air Force, and he was, I believe, a loadmaster on C-46s flying in the China-Burma-India Theater.
Or the hump.
Unfortunately, and this is why I like being here, I never got to sit down and ask him, so what did you really do? I mean, what was daily life like? How warm was it? I guess it was really warm. Were there bad guys around that were shooting at you, or did you fly in the airplanes? I'm making this so that anybody that might be interested in me might be able to not ask the question, but just see the video.
The question most is, hey, Grandpa or Dad, what did you do in the war?
Yeah.
While you still are able to tell it. That's the important thing. Dead men tell no tales.
I'm not sure I can remember a lot of it.
Okay, well, that's something we'll have to work on. Now, let's go through school years, if you will. Did you graduate high school, college, anything like that?
Yeah. Went to high school in Syracuse, went to junior high school and high school in Syracuse, New York. Went to Syracuse University. Unfortunately, it took me 5 years to get through because I piddled around a lot. Wasn't too interested in academics, but eventually got through in 5 years and got a bachelor's degree in chemistry. At the same time, I was in the ROTC program, and therefore, at the same time I graduated, I also became a second lieutenant in the Air Force.
Okay, very good. Now, when did you go into the service? Upon graduation or sometime thereafter?
No, I graduated in June of 1961 and was commissioned that same day. And in August, July or August of that same year, I was off to navigator school. Now you see the four-eyed figure here. When I got into the Air Force, the only people that go to pilot training had 20/20 vision. If you didn't have 20/20 vision, you didn't go to pilot training. And I'd always wanted to fly, so I said, well, the next best thing is to become a navigator. And that's where I went after graduation, was to navigator school, James Conley Air Force Base in Waco, Texas.
And then from there, how long were you in that before you got your qualified?
That takes about a year. And again, from 61 to 62, I was in navigator school. And when you get out of school, you're ranked by class standing to get your choice of assignments. I wasn't particularly well ranked, but I took the assignment to go to the next school, which was Electronic Warfare Training School. That sent me to Mather Air Force Base in Sacramento, California, for another year of training.
Wow.
Eventually, I got through the training and was assigned a job in EB-47Es. My job was to, along with another electronic warfare officer, to fly in the bomb bay of a B-47 with electronic equipment to jam enemy radars. It was a fascinating job because there was no place to take off in the bomb bay, so we had to take off sitting next to the pilots in the front side, in the aisle, as it were.
Yeah.
And after takeoff, we climbed down a ladder, opened a door, crawled on our hands and knees to the bomb bay, opened that door, got in our ejection seats after closing the door and pressurizing, and that's where we flew the mission.
Okay, with the parachute, I hope.
We had parachutes.
Okay.
It was a downward ejection system. Nobody ever tried it, so we don't know if it ever worked. But the point was you couldn't take off there because if the airplane crash landed, there was no way you could get out of the bomb bay. So then, of course, when we landed, we had to climb back into the front again. Sometimes things happened. The ladder that we would climb down was the same ladder we used to get into the airplane, so it was an extension ladder. And every once in a while, when we climbed down the ladder would slip a couple of rungs. So we'd be a little jolted there, so am I going to go out? We had a parachute, so it was okay. After a short period of time there, naturally the B-47s were retired. I went to more training, to electronic warfare training for the B-52. That sent me to Wurtsmith Air Force Base in Michigan, way upstate Michigan, where I flew the B-52H model as electronic warfare officer.
Now, are you up there in the wintertime where it's not exactly comfortable?
Several years. It's not too good in the winter, no. It's a very long winter. Those were, again, fascinating times. We flew missions sometimes as much as 24 hours long, where we had 3 pilots and 3 navigators, electronic warfare officer, and a gunner. And our job was to fly up to Thule, Greenland, and circle Thule, because Thule was an early warning area where if the bad guys fired missiles or came at us, we were going to be right there. And our job was to make sure that Thule stayed active. We talked to them on the radio every 15 minutes and just flew round and round in big circles. We were at the time armed with nuclear weapons. In case the horn went off, we would just keep going and do what we were supposed to do.
Or we have in-air refueling to keep up?
Oh, over and over and over. I can't even imagine how many times we refueled. It was a lot.
Do you ever have to fly the boom, or is that just other people's jobs?
That was the pilots. The pilots had that problem, and then that's why there were 3 of them, because 2 of them couldn't really do the job for 24 hours. It would, one of them was sleeping most of the time. The electronic warfare officer and the gunner were the chefs. We cooked the in-flight meals, such as they were, and provided the coffee, and provided some of the radio transmissions.
Well, didn't you have a backup too? So you were on and off?
No.
You were on 24?
Well, we were, but we were allowed to sleep. The gunner and I would alternate sleeping because we both sat together facing backwards in the airplane. So we each had our own ejection seats, of course, but we could sleep on the floor. If one guy was sitting in his seat, the other guy could sleep on the floor. So that's what we did. We alternated sleeping.
Like the Navy warm bunk, huh? Yes, we
Just
slept.
about,
That's warm.
Right.
I'll take that over.
Just about.
Now, during that, if without divulging any secrets, did you ever have any blips along the line that said something might be coming in your area? Or shouldn't I ask?
No, that was Strategic Air Command was who ran the system, and they would do alerts all the time in which whoever was on alert, and we were on alert a week at a time, would report to the airplane, and we'd all jump into the airplane, and depending upon what kind of an exercise it was, we would start the engines or not. Sometimes we'd start the engines and taxi down the runway. We never actually took off because there was never a real threat coming at us. The idea was to get the airplanes off the ground before the missiles from the Soviet Union hit our airbase. And we had time to do that, like 10 or 15 minutes. We had to be at the airplane and off the ground. So it was pretty interesting. Pretty loud klaxon, which would get you to your airplane. After that, I quit the Air Force.
Oh, you quit, just walked away.
Yeah. I was in for 5 years, and I needed more education, so I went to Central Michigan University and spent a year there and got my master's degree in mathematics. After that, I went to work for IBM down in Poughkeepsie, New York. And that wasn't very exciting because I was a computer programmer and we were using, some people may remember this, the IBM 360, which required you to punch cards to program the computer. So we each had to punch cards for our programs, and then the cards would be put in the IBM 360. They returned several hours later, was not a fast machine, and then the errors had to be punched on new cards to continue the program. I wasn't very excited about this job. And in the New York Times in probably 69, they had a full-page ad from the Republic Aviation on Long Island showing an F-105. And I thought, boy, that is really a nice airplane. I really wish I were a fighter pilot. And at the time, the Wild Weasels came into effect. Now, Wild Weasels were flying F-105s.
Now, what are the Wild Weasels? Give us a rundown of that group.
The Wild Weasel program was developed because of the surface-to-air missiles in Vietnam. The surface-to-air missiles were shooting down F-105s at the rate of about 50%.
Ooh.
And this was not acceptable. So we developed an anti-radiation missile to hang on an airplane which would home in on the radars that were guiding the surface-to-air missiles. Unfortunately, somebody had to drive the airplane and somebody had to do the electronics to figure out where the missile was, when to launch our missile, what to do in case their missile started. So the Wild Weasel was invented. The first Weasels were in F-100s. They were two-seater F-100s, but that didn't work out real well because the F-100 couldn't keep up with the F-105. The 105 flew fairly fast, around 450 knots or so. So they said, all right, why don't we put the Weasel program into the F-105? And we bought the two-seat F-105s, which were F models then, and put an electronic warfare officer, that's me, in the back seat, and a pilot who was very well qualified in the front seat. They only took very experienced pilots to fly the airplane because I guess it was very difficult to fly. I never flew it, so and that program was advertising for electronic warfare officers. And the paper said, sign up. So I did. I wrote to the Air Force and said, I'm interested in being a Wild Weasel. And probably in return mail, I got a letter saying, you're in.
Yep.
Report here, report here, report here, report here. And I went to all those places and ended up at Nellis going to Wild Weasel School with 8 other crews. And we were mated with a pilot so that the pilot and the EW always flew together. And this worked very well because we each needed to know what the other was doing.
Okay.
The pilot needed that extra pair of eyes to see what was in back of him or where the missiles were. And he needed the electronics interpreted to be able to say, where is that missile coming from? How dangerous is it? Should we be worried now or not? And can we shoot at him before he shoots at us? That was one of the hard parts about being a weasel. The surface-to-air missile, the SA-2 that the Soviets had installed in North Vietnam, was faster than our missile when it went off our airplane. So if he fired first, his missile would get to us before our missile would get to him. So we had to calculate when to fire so that ours went first.
Because otherwise, he was going to shoot, though. That's kind of a dicey game, isn't it?
You know because of the electronics.
Okay.
The electronics, which was my department, would tell you when he was going to shoot just before.
A beep or something in your...
Well, there was certain tones, certain frequencies. A tracking radar has a certain sound. You can hear it, you know what it is. The other piece of equipment would tell you where it was and how far away it was, so that by looking at the equipment, you could say whether he was going to shoot, how soon he was going to shoot, where he was in relation to you.
Whoa. Was any of this over the horizon, or is this
no?
line of sight?
This is all locally line of sight.
Okay.
Our missiles were only good for 10 miles, which means you had to be pretty close to a SAM site to shoot at it. Unfortunately, his missiles were good out to 25 miles, which meant, of course, he could shoot first if he saw you.
He was there.
Yeah. We'd know he was coming because we'd have the electronics, but that didn't mean he shouldn't shoot before we did. It was a fascinating job. I spent all of 1970 in Thailand, part-time at Korat, part-time at Takli. And all our missions, because it was a bombing halt then, were in Laos or, can't say it, Cambodia or South Vietnam. We were flying jet airplanes with bombs. Little story here. We were flying around in Laos, and we always had to fly the two-seat airplane as the lead with 3 D models, which were single-seat 105s. And we all carried bombs, 500-pound bombs, 750-pound bombs. And we bombed targets where the Viet Cong were amassing supplies or on the Ho Chi Minh Trail or whatever. We unfortunately got a little complacent in the middle of the summer, and we flew our flight of 4, and everyone attacked from about the same area. We'd roll around and roll in. Dive angles were not very steep. The speeds were not very good. So one of the airplanes in our flight took a 37 millimeter through the wing. Big hole in the wing. Fuel splashing out. The gentleman I was flying with, Nels Running, who was from the Air Force Academy, matter of fact, went back as a Major General to run the Air Force Academy, said to me, "You got the stick, I'm going to read the emergency list," because there's an emergency list before you get hit. And having never flown the airplane before, I said, "Roger," and I took the stick and the throttle and kept the airplane in the sky, I guess you'd say, is about all I did.
You didn't bump into it.
I didn't hit anybody. But Nels, after about 30 seconds, said, "Have you flown this airplane before?" I said, "No, I haven't." He said, "You read the emergency list, I'll fly the airplane." So anyway, Bill Wyckoff was
right off the bat.
Yeah, Bill Wyckoff was a pilot in the airplane, and we pointed him in the right way, right direction. He jumped out. The airplane went down, obviously. But he was back at the officers' club that night, so everything ended fine. But it was one of my experiences where I don't even know how to fly this airplane. Well, you're not supposed to.
Anybody ever had the suggestion that, hey, if I'm going to be a co-pilot, or did someone topside that made it a requirement?
You couldn't do that because the folks in my position were called bears, B-E-A-R, because from the back cockpit, it was like a bear's den. We had equipment piled up in front of us. You could just barely see out the front. You couldn't see out the back at all. And when the F-105 takes off, it goes nose high. When it lands, it goes nose high, very high. So you couldn't land or take off anyway from the back seat. You could fly straight and level. You could not refuel because the refueling receptacle was in front of the pilot. You couldn't even see it from the back seat. So it was fine if you were flying a long distance, which I've done also, to just fly the airplane, but of course it had autopilot, so
Yeah,
why
you
bother?
keep the button on. Yeah.
Yeah. But that
There
was
must have been some sort of, if you will, emergency, so that if you were say the pilot was conked off and you had to bring it in, what would you do?
you couldn't.
Punch out?
The ejection system was rigged so that if one person ejected, the other one would eject shortly thereafter. So basically, if the pilot were out, the backseater could fly the airplane, could keep it in the air with the throttle and the stick, but couldn't land it, couldn't really refuel it by any means, couldn't get anywhere. So if the backseater ejected, shortly thereafter, I think it was 10 seconds, something like that.
Whatever.
Then the front seat went. On the other hand, if the front seater went, 10 seconds later, the back seat would go. So the sequence was that if the airplane was flyable, the pilot would say, we're going to have to get out.
Okay.
You go. So the back seat would go, and then right after he went, the pilot would eject himself. Ejections were not very good. Lots of people broke legs or arms or whatever because it was a rocket seat. The rocket just fired. And
You had to pull the curtain down and all that?
no curtain.
No curtain?
No. Just had a D-ring between your legs, and the whole thing went right out through the canopy. Canopy blew off, and then you went out through it.
Words of one syllable. Wow.
Yeah. Had to have you should have had your helmet with your visor down and everything tightened up, but people didn't fly that way. You didn't fly ready to eject. So if you had to eject and you were still flying, you could get ready. If, as in some cases, you got hit and the airplane was just uncontrollable, you just pulled the handle and hoped. Very exciting times. At any rate, 1970 was a very slow year because of the bombing halt until November 20th in 1970, when President Nixon, and oddly enough, we have this copy here of President Nixon's notes, regardless of who you liked. He was the president at the time.
Can you read
saying,
that,
this was to Melvin Laird, the Department of Defense. As I told Moore after our meeting yesterday, regardless of results, the men on this project have my complete backing, and there will be no second guessing if the plan fails. It is worth the risk, and the planning is superb. I will be at Camp David Saturday. I would like for you to call me as soon as you have anything to report. Now, this was called the Sante Raid. We had a very small part, the Weasels. We're helping some very brave Special Forces folks who landed in the Sante prison in North Vietnam in an attempt to get the prisoners out. They flew at
what year, what time frame are we talking?
1970,
Okay,
November 1970, when we hadn't been up north in over a year. Had no airplanes, no bombing up there at all. Needless to say, they were surprised. It was a mission that was so secret that we didn't even know what we were doing. We were told where to fly and what to do, but not what the real mission was. The folks on the helicopters were told only at the last minute what the mission was. They trained for months in Florida. They flew in on helicopters, being refueled by C-130s at several hundred feet above the ground. I mean, they were down in the weeds.
Treetop.
Yes. And the C-130s had to minimize their speed so that the helicopters could maximize their speed and keep up, because the helicopters were loaded with Special Forces. One of the Special Forces helicopters landed inside the prison. One landed across the river at another area. There's an entire book written about that.
Yes, sir.
By John Gargis, who was one of the participants, if you will, in this.
He's still alive.
He is. He will be in New Hampshire every summer. He's got a summer place up here now. These people were something else. Our job as Weasels was to go into the Hanoi area and orbit and see if we could get all the people with the missiles on the ground to shoot at us instead of noticing that there were low-level people and shoot at them.
The extraction crew.
Right. So we were cruising around. It's 2 o'clock in the morning, so it's pitch black. Needless to say, there were no lights in Hanoi at all. I mean, they were aware that they weren't going to be in very good shape. We were given a briefing about how soon missiles would be fired at us, who would fire them, where they would fire from. We were all We'd never seen a missile before. Okay, we'll go do it. So there were 5 F-105s involved. 4 went in, and the 5th one stayed out for
Flying cover.
in case anybody got hit. The Navy provided a fake input at Haiphong Harbor so that the Vietnamese would look to Haiphong. The Air Force also provided F-4s as cover for the MiGs, although that was pretty safe since the MiGs didn't fly at night. They weren't capable of flying at night.
No night radar?
Nope. They were all radar control, those that did go up, and they were never up at night. So we went up there, and I have a tape at home of a very garbled tape of what we talked about back and forth. And missiles were fought, and we shot missiles at them, and they shot missiles at us, and we ducked and dodged, and one of the airplanes got hit. So he left, and on the way back, he didn't quite make it back to the base. His airplane was so badly hit that he didn't have any gas, so he jumped out in Plaine de Jars in Laos, got picked up the next morning. But the big disappointment was, even though we didn't know what the mission was, we found out later that when they went into the prison, the prisoners had already gone.
Oh.
That because the river that ran by the prison had flooded, and apparently the Vietnamese were afraid they'd flood themselves out as well as the prisoners. They didn't care about the prisoners, so they moved them all. As a result, however, of that raid, the North Vietnamese were apparently very, very worried, because if they can do it once, they can do it again.
Mm-hmm.
So they started putting all the prisoners together. They moved most of them to the Hanoi area, which was the first time many of the prisoners even knew anybody else was prisoner, because they'd all been kept separate all this time in various prisons.
Around the jungles, yeah.
Yep. And the POWs that I met that were at Son Tay, or the ones that were in other places in North Vietnam, were very, very pleased with the fact that we'd made that raid. Even though we weren't successful in getting prisoners out, their treatment improved tremendously. They got to see other people, which they hadn't been able to do. Almost all of them were in solitary. They got better food, they got a change of clothing, and they got to talk to each other, which was amazing for them. And I've received nothing but friendly things from the POWs who were there, saying that made a lot of difference. So it was successful in that way.
Was that what they call the Hanoi Hilton?
There were some of them were at the Hanoi Hilton. The Son Tay was not there.
Okay.
It was 25 miles west of Hanoi.
All right.
But many of the missiles came from that area, and we don't even know from that perspective how many missiles were fired at each of us, because at 2 o'clock in the morning you can't see the other guy on your side, don't know where he is. So we're all flying around blind with missiles going off right and left and above and below. And it was, we never actually got to put together how many missiles did they actually fire. Probably at least a dozen, maybe 15 at the 4 of us. So we don't know, we don't know how we did.
Well, how were you flying? Any kind of a formation?
Oh, no formations, not night. All by ourselves.
Okay, oh, that's even better.
Yeah. You use the TACAN to determine quadrants in which you could fly. Now, you could only have a certain quadrant to fly in, but you had to be free to fly any altitude, because when a missile is fired at you, you have to duck. And one of the ways you do is to get to low altitude, because the missile, surface-to-air missile, was not very controllable at low altitudes. So the idea was to get very low, and the missile would go off somewhere and blow itself up. So to keep from running into each other, you just believed that there was so much airspace up there. What was the likelihood of hitting another airplane? Very small. So that's what you hoped, and sure enough, we didn't.
Did you some guts?
Well, at any rate, after that, I spent my year in Thailand, then went back to McConnell as still 105s, still Weasels. And then they said, we need a volunteer, never volunteer, for Thailand to go back for another 6 weeks program. They need another crew, fly Weasel. So I did. And then in August, I believe it was July or August must have been July of 71, we got the dreaded phone call in the middle of the night that said, "You are going to Thailand tomorrow. Pack your bag." So our squadron, half of our squadron at McConnell, was tasked to go back to Thailand as Wild Weasels again, as a Wild Weasel squadron. So my pilot and I flew from McConnell to Korat, Thailand in an F-105. Now, this is a little long. You have to strap into the ejection seat the whole time because one never knows. When you're going from the West Coast to Hawaii, the F-105 is a very big, heavy airplane, uses a lot of gas. So when you're in the middle between Hawaii and the West Coast, you must constantly refuel. So you have a tanker up there, and you have 4 F-105s, 2 on each wing. Somebody is always refueling. So you just keep rotating around and around because the airplane didn't hold enough gas to get to either Hawaii or the West Coast. So if you couldn't get refueled, you just crash.
Couldn't you go up the top side and take a long glide angle down? Or doesn't that work?
No way.
It's like a rock glides.
The Navy had ships out there halfway between in case our airplanes didn't make it. So we flew to Hawaii, stay overnight, get in the airplane the next day, fly to the Philippines, stay overnight, get in the airplane the next day, fly to Korat, Thailand. And then the people that were there, the squadron that was there, said, well, we don't want you guys to fly combat because you're not used to it. And everybody said, we're going to fly with our pilots. We are crewed up here.
Yeah, we're buddies.
So that was discovered, and you were 12 hours out of sync when you went from the U.S. to Thailand. So it took several days before you knew which day it was.
Get the body clock going.
But it didn't matter because you either were on nights or you were on days because we flew every single day, every single night. Nights are better because at night you can see the launch of an SA-2. It's a big flame blows out there. And you say, whoa, well, there goes one, regardless of your electronics. Daytime, it was a little harder. Night was also easier that if the missile were at you, what you would see is a big orange glow with a black dot in the middle. The black dot was the missile, and the glow was its exhaust. If you could see a stream of exhaust, no problem, it's not coming at us.
You see that dot, though.
You see the dot, then we got a problem.
Gets your attention.
So because of the lack of airplanes and crews, we rotated every 6 months. It was known as the 179-day TDY. It was just 2 or 3 days short of being a permanent change of station, so you could keep going back and forth and back and forth. So we did that. Every 6 months, our crews rotated there. Another story about that, there was a kind of a bad situation. When we first got there, our first mission was about a week or so after we got there, going to the Hanoi area, daytime, 4 F-105s. Wild Weasels go in first. See if you can get the missiles to shoot at you so that when the airplane's behind you, the fighters with the bombs won't get shot down by missiles. And then you loiter in case they rearmed, so in case they shoot again, you're still there. So
you a cannon fodder?
Yeah. First in, last out.
Oh, good. First.
So we're flying a formation of it was called 4 abreast. There's 2 airplanes over here, about a half a mile back and another mile over, 2 more airplanes. We were number 3. And the number 4 airplane had a little problem in that his engine wasn't quite as good as the others. So he kept lagging a little bit, and we kept telling me, keep up, keep up. He said, well, I'm trying to, but my engine just isn't that good. And we're approaching Hanoi, and we look out in front of us, and I look at my equipment, and there's missiles coming up, surface-to-air missiles. And everybody's looking. Holy cow, what's going on? And we're looking at our equipment, doesn't say anything. Meantime, a MiG-21 has taken off and flown at low altitude and come up behind us. We didn't see him, neither did number 4, who probably got shot down by an ATOL missile.
Like an AOC, or spotter.
Yep. ATOL missile hit him. Yeah. So immediately, everything goes to hell. We look back, and this is hazy, but I believe what I saw was a MiG-21 firing an ATOL right at our tail. And I, of course, screamed. And we broke left, and I think I heard that missile go by our canopy. That's how close it was to hitting us. And needless to say, the guys got shot down, jumped out, became POWs for almost a year. Talley and Paget. I always remember the names. And from then on, we kind of figured out that was their tactic. Shoot the missiles off, get those guys that are weasels, they know the weasels are coming, to look at you and sneak up behind you. Only worked once, because we didn't let that happen again. But
It's a lesson well learned, though.
another war story. Yes. How are we doing on time?
You're doing quite well.
You want to go on from
If you will take it a little bit further.
after back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, which was pretty good, really. That's my feeling is that's what I was hired to do,
Okay.
was fly airplanes and fly combat and do good stuff. Went back to Wichita. From there, I transferred to Nellis and became part of what is now known, or was then known first time, of Red Flag, when we trained crews to fly in the Nevada area to fight missiles. We were training the weasels, and that kind of went away because the war was over. So I had an opportunity then to go to Germany, and I thought that was good. With a name like Ober, where would you like to go?
Put you right up there, kid, over the other guys.
Unfortunately, it was not a flying job. I probably should have stayed with airplanes, but I thought, boy, this is an opportunity. So I ended up for 4+ years in Germany in United States Air Force's Europe intelligence, where we studied the Soviets and what they would do tactic-wise, airplanes, bombs, things like that. And it was very interesting because we coordinated with other NATO countries. So they would come to our place and we would go to their places, and we'd talk about things that we could talk about with each other countries.
Mutual aid.
Yeah, each country has their own intelligence, obviously. And sometimes we had intelligence that we got from a source that we couldn't tell another country about it, because then they would know what they shouldn't know. So it's a very, very strange way things are done. But we
Kiddie around there.
interfaced with a lot of them. After that, I went to Fort Bliss, Texas, in El Paso, as the part of the Air Liaison Group, because that's where the United States Surface-to-Air Missile Group was. And we had two things to do with there. One was to tell them what the Soviets were going to do in terms of defeating surface-to-air missiles. And the other one was to tell them what we were going to do so they wouldn't shoot down the good guys, because their motto was shoot them down, sort them out on the ground, which we didn't much care for.
It's like that.
So after spending 3 years there, I went to my final assignment, which was down the road in Bedford at Hanscom, where I worked on what equipment we were buying to counter what the Soviets were buying to counter the U.S. buying to counter, and so on, counter back and forth. And I retired from there.
So you had a pretty busy life.
Well, that was only 22 years.
I know. Now, going back, if you will, I'd like you to read your citation with respect to the Silver Star, if you don't mind.
The Silver Star was awarded to, I wouldn't say all, many of the people that were on the Sante prison raid. You want me to read the whole thing?
If you can.
This is a citation to accompany the award of the Silver Star to Russell T. Ober III. Captain Russell T. Ober III distinguished himself by gallantry in connection with military operations against an opposing armed force during the prisoner of war search and rescue operation at Son-Tay, North Vietnam, on 21 December 1970. Notice the way this is phrased: prisoner of war search and rescue operation. Okay. Captain Ober, in complete disregard for his personal safety, led his flight deep into enemy territory against enemy surface-to-air missile installations. Captain Ober repeatedly exposed himself to the enemy in an attempt to draw attention and fire away from the slower, more vulnerable rescue aircraft. Consequently, he was forced to take violent action to evade the many surface-to-air missiles fired at him. Despite the danger to his safety, Captain Ober continued to engage a high-threat surface-to-air missile site until he finally silenced it. As a result of his heroic efforts, the enemy missile crews were unable to engage the rescue force. This courageous and aggressive action enabled the rescue forces to complete their mission and successfully withdraw from the objective area. By his gallantry and devotion to duty, Captain Ober has reflected great credit upon himself and the United States Air Force.
And this is the picture, if you will, of the general.
Yeah, this is Major General Blood awarding the Silver Star. This was a publicity photo. You could see several of the other folks that were on this flight. We all got the Silver Star at the same time. Some of the more daring of the weasels, there are.
It's a good company, though.
There are 2 weasel crews that both won the Medal of Honor because of what they did. I mean, weaseling was a interesting thing.
Now, you also, in your brochure, you had 2 DFCs.
Yeah.
Would you care to expand on those, if you will? I don't want to embarrass you if you don't want to. But
It's kind of a thing where we flew rather frequently, 4 or 5 times a week, sometimes every day, sometimes every night, depending on whether you're on nights or days. And in 71, 2, and part of 3, there were lots of missiles fired. It took these guys not very long to rearm. And every time we went up there, we got hammered, basically. We went up there and ahead of everybody, and they shot at us a lot. And we shot at them a lot. And we used to come back, and because of the way medals are arranged, if you went to North Vietnam, you got a 1/10 of an air medal. So for every 10 missions, you got 1 air medal.
okay.
If you flew down in South Vietnam or in Laos, it took you 20 missions to get an air medal. So we went up there, and the pilot I flew with, Murray Denton, was something else, a very super pilot. We go up there, and we'd fly around, and we'd get shot at by 3 or 4 missiles, maybe half a dozen. We'd see a MiG somewhere in the distance, and say, oh my God, don't want to see that. We'd fire our missiles. We think we hit our targets some of the times. And we come back and say, man, that was a great mission. Yeah, another 1/10 of an air medal, whoopee.
Yep.
Some of the missions just so happened that we got DFCs for. I mean, it was almost, I wouldn't say arbitrary, but every mission we flew was very worthwhile. But as I've had several Marines say to me, that's what you were hired to do, right?
Yeah.
That was your job.
That was
yeah,
my
okay,
job,
so
you know.
you hung it out. Yeah, big deal.
Okay.
So,
Let's shift gears a little bit. Now, you served your time, you retired. What did you then do as far as follow up?
well, since I had a degree in chemistry, a master's in math, I got a bachelor's degree in German while I was in Germany, I decided I would teach school. And in those days, the early 80s, if you were a math teacher, you were gold. Nobody taught math or science in those days, apparently because of the way the system worked with teachers. And I went down to my local school, Alpern High School. I said, I've got a master's degree in math. Would you like me to teach here? And he had me sign on the dotted line right then.
You couldn't leave the office.
No. How much do you want to make? What do you need? We can take care of you. And I said, well, I've taught in college, but high school is a lot different than college. He said, well, you should take 1 course in psychology and you'll be qualified. So I did.
Oh.
Took 1 course in psychology.
You got a GED then.
And I was qualified. I taught there for 17 years. I was one of the 3 that were considered the, how do you say it, the most difficult teachers. There was 1 English teacher, 1 chemistry teacher, and me, that the good students said, we want those teachers. The bad student says,
hang them.
We don't want them.
Yeah,
Don't put them in that class.
You got to work.
And the part I enjoyed was having students have epiphanies, if you will. They would learn something and say, you didn't know that 6 months ago, did you? No, I didn't. Well, I really did. Well, yes, you did. I still today have students from the local area say, I had you in class in 1985. Oh, I don't know who you are, but thank you. And either they'll say, I hated you the most of everybody, or yours was the best class I had.
Yeah.
So
and that's the payoff for all these little ones. Not one-upping, but I had the same kind of experience. I was taught at the community college for 14 years. And one afternoon downtown, just meandering, if you will, I get thumped on the back, damn near drove me to the cement. And I get up and I said, "What's going on?" He said, "Hi, Mr. Stevens." He said, "I just wanted to say thank you." He said, "For what?" He said, "When I took your class bump years ago, you said that no matter how hard I tried, if I did an honest job, I would pass. But you had to work for it. You play cute, you're going to go down the tubes." I took that to heart, and I really applied. He said, "You turned me around. I just want to say thank you." And I said, "Well, please, don't thank me next week. I can't move." But ever have that feeling when you see the light goes on, the epiphany,
yeah.
or whatever, and
There
bingo.
There were a few students like that.
Yeah.
Not many of them
They're
were.
not many, but boy, they sure pay a lot of freight.
Well, having somebody say thank you reminds me of the stories that were around about when people came back from Vietnam. Many of them were not greeted, not well, but not at all.
Not at all. They were despised.
I find that it's amazing today that the way the people returning from Afghanistan and Iraq are treated, because they're treated very well. We will do anything to help you. We know what you did. And from my point of view, that's the way it should be.
Yeah. They're welcomed home.
Yes.
Night
Two
and
stories.
day.
Two stories. We seldom flew back commercially. We always flew in an Air Force airplane or our own fighters. But one time we did fly back commercially. There were, I don't know, 6 or 8 of us. And we had to fly in Class A uniforms. With in the Air Force it was blues, and the Army it was greens. And that was a requirement. If you're going to fly commercial, you had to fly in your Class A. Now, that was a little worrisome because at this time, people were not pleased with the way the military was, or the Vietnam, the whole thing. So we landed in San Francisco, and the guy who was flying was apparently an Air Force guy. And he said, "I'd like to welcome to San Francisco, and I'd like you people to know that there are however many, 8 or 10, whatever the number was, of returning combat veterans from Vietnam." And the whole airplane applauded.
Hey.
And we go, "Huh? Wow, this is something." You know, that only happened once, but that was a
Made
nice
you
time.
feel good.
Oh yeah. You say, well, I guess everybody doesn't hate us.
Yeah. No. That's it's your show, but I've got to put this one in. We were lucky enough to do a story about the USS Kirk. You ever hear the story about that?
Nope.
They were there at the evacuation of Saigon. And through their action and a lot of inter-service cooperation, they were credited with saving almost 32,000 people. Ships came from nowhere. They just offloaded and moved. Some of the guys are flying helicopters. They'd come out over the ships, drop their gang, and go and
Get more.
get back if they could, or they just deep six their copters. Some guy had a big Huey, and he put his family over, came alongside and hovered so they could drop to the ground. The crews caught them in arms and blankets. The guy went back up, turned off, and killed the motor, dropped it, and he went out the side door, and he had to go down deep so the rotors wouldn't be hit him, and they got him in a small boat. When they got to the Philippines, because it was the way they said it, they were honoring the North Korean position that they were now a foreign ship. They had a change of ship command at sea, and they went from the old Korean Navy to a U.S. ship. Then they were allowed to enter the Philippines. But it's a story that we're trying to show that so that the people who said, all the nasty things they said about the guys in Nam, this should be a counter. It's one try, but I'm going to keep trying doing it because it's not fair.
There are more, I think there are more good stories about what happened in Vietnam than there are bad. The bad ones were the ones that were publicized.
Oh, yeah.
The good ones you bury somewhere. Don't
That's
talk
right.
about that.
The building of schools and hospitals and all that kind of good stuff. Okay, now that you're through, you've come back, you've been a teacher for all these years, but now I understand you're dabbling in politics. How about a little stats of that?
After 17 years of teaching, some of the politics, if you will, of teaching made it so that I didn't want to do that anymore. Much of the feeling was that we wanted the students to feel good about themselves. And my contention was I want them to learn math.
Amen.
And if you don't learn math, I don't care how you feel about yourself, you still flunk. This was not an approved method. So when I had my time in, I said, all right, I'll go do something else. And I retired from that. And because I varied a little bit, talked about military, talked about politics in my classes occasionally, not very much, but sometimes, and talked to my students, one of my students said, why don't you run for office? I don't know. I never thought of it.
Okay.
Yeah. And at this time in Hudson, we had, I don't remember the number, 8 or 9 representatives in the New Hampshire House. And it came time for the election right after I had retired. And for my particular party, there weren't enough people running to fill all the seats. And I said, well, okay, how do I sign up? So I went down to the town, you pay your $2, and you're running. Oh, well, that was good.
Don't feel any different.
So I was on the list, and sure enough, I got elected. I said, wow. So I went to the House of Representatives. It takes you at least a year to figure out what's going on up there, and sometimes longer. But I'm a quiet person, so I just tried to watch and learn. And we came to the next election, because every 2 years in this state. And I thought, boy, that was easy. Only this time, there were several people running more than there were seats, which means a primary. Now, primary election weeds out too many people down to only the number of people that you have seats for, basically. Well, I thought that was pretty easy first time, so I just ignored it, and I lost. Didn't make it through the primary. However, my wife did. She ran for office also. So the next time around, she and I both running, we made an honest effort to make sure that people knew who we were and what we stood for and how we would expect to vote. Mm-hmm. And so since then, she and I have both won our elections. So we're running for our 12th
in
year
tandem
each. Yes.
Good.
We serve in different committees. We sit together in the House, and people often ask, what if you vote differently? So what?
Yeah.
That has nothing to do with anything. And several people who are husband and wife said, I can't sit next to my husband because he will just berate me something terribly if I vote differently. And no, we just don't. We have a standing joke, and we've done this 1,000 times. She serves on the Finance Committee and has for several years. I serve on the Ways and Means Committee and have for several years. So the joke is, I get the money, she spends it, which is how it works.
Mutual cooperation.
We said that's how it works at home, right? No.
Oh, good.
So I'm still doing that. It's still, I was told by a senator many, many years ago, if it stops being fun, don't do it anymore.
Amen.
Because you make $100 a year, which is not enough
overpaid.
Yeah, not like Massachusetts, but you don't get any freebies. You drive up to Concord 3 or 4 or 5 days a week for 6 months. The pay is ridiculous. You do get free ride on the turnpike, though. You don't have to pay toll. Yeah,
wow. Yeah. Can I ride with
that's
you?
It. Yes. And that's really about all you get. There's no prestige. There are 400 members of the House. So nobody can bribe anybody to get a law done because there's no way to convince 400 people. The part I like the most, I think, and I tell this to the tourists in the State House, everything is so open. We, that is the members, will ask for laws to be written to do something or other that maybe somebody asks us about. And then that proposed law goes to a committee, which is public. Anybody can come into any committee anytime. All right, so now people can hear what you have to say about this. Then if it passes the committee, it goes to the full House, which is public. It is on TV. Everything that happens is open.
Yeah.
You can see everything, see what everybody says, how everybody voted. Every vote that's taken in the House, that's a roll call vote, you can see how everybody voted. If you don't like the way they voted, give them a call.
Okay.
And that openness is what I like, because I talk to the tourists, and say you can go anywhere you want to in either building. There are no metal detectors. There are no policemen. We are a wide open society here. You want to see something?
Great.
Just go and see it. You can go in a room, see what the things are, just an amazing thing. I don't see that anywhere else in the world. That it's so open to the public that you can do whatever you want to do.
You're kind of wrapping it up, if you will, taking, seeing things, if you will, with all you've seen and done and so forth, can you identify your service years and experience as a positive or negative effect on your life?
Well, it was definitely positive, no question about that. From a time that I'd been growing up and watching airplanes, I'd always wanted to fly. Now, it was a big disappointment in college when my eyes failed me and the Air Force said 20/20 or nothing, and I was nothing. But I didn't get to fly. Well, I didn't get to drive, I got to fly, and I believe what I was doing was useful, and that the mission would not have been accomplished without me. All the other things I did in the Air Force, I think, were worthwhile, that I made a difference, if that's the way you put it. Sometimes you put that in quotes. I made a difference.
You had your own epiphany now and then.
But yeah, it was a positive experience. I have told many of my students when I was teaching, I said, I think the best job in the world is to be a fighter pilot. And they say, what? I said, yeah. Every day you fly, you take your life in your hands. That airplane may break. Yeah, we do the best we can to make good airplanes. But what if it breaks?
Yeah.
You die. You get that? You're out doing your business and you die. On the other hand, if you're good at it, then you're a hero. Because in wartime, you do good things. You kill the bad guys. And they always ended with, we had a motto on our wall in Thailand. The mission of the United States Air Force is to fly and to fight, and don't you forget it.
Amen.
I always like that.
Press to fresh, my friend. I thank you for sharing it. It was a great show. We'll get together later.
Yeah.
Okay? That's a wrap, folks. Again, this is what one fellow did way back when, and what it's meant to him, and how he, in turn, has affected the lives of so many people. To those of you who see the show, perhaps it'll change your mind, and we ask you to come and see us. The address will be on the back. It'll be something that I think will be your worthwhile, and I know it'll be for the company. Bob Stevens saying again, thank you, stay healthy, come and see us.
The preceding program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.